In this video, I shall explain the assessment criteria and the examples of suitable evidence which you can submit to demonstrate your competence against each assessment criterion for the Unit 5, which is Develop, Identify, Assess and Control Health and Safety Risks. This unit has total 5 learning outcomes. The first 3 relates to the skill domain, and the fourth one is related to the knowledge domain, and the last one relates to your CPD. For all skill-based assessment criteria, you will need to submit documentary evidence from your workplace and provide a brief narrative of the evidence. That is, your role in the subject activity for which you submitted an evidence. The documentary evidence of your competence can be the documents, records, pictures, and videos, etc. Your submitted evidence must be valid, authentic, current, sufficient, and reliable. For knowledge-based assessment criteria, you shall need to submit written response against each assessment criteria in your own words. Your response must be limited between 250 to 350 words against each assessment criteria. And for the CPD, you will need to download the specific form from the resources section and fill it out and submit it to the assessor. There are total 6 assessment criteria in the first learning outcome. Let's discuss each assessment criterion, that what it requires from you and what can be the suitable evidence. 1.1 is identify the requirements to carry out a health and safety inspection. You can submit evidence that you can identify the requirements for carrying out the health and safety inspections in your organization. That is, what areas in the workplace or what activities or the processes need to be inspected for health and safety performance measurement. You can submit health and safety inspection plan for the organization, list of key OHS processes and the relevant inspection plan for these processes, for example, emergency evacuation process, communication process, training process, risk assessment process, etc. Health and safety inspection sampling plan and criteria for sampling, for example, new equipment or process, new worker, new raw material, number of OHS incidents or non-conformities, etc. 1.2 Inspect the workplace to identify and evaluate hazards. You have to submit evidence that you can identify and evaluate the OHS hazards based on their significance. You can submit hazard identification and evaluation forms record. 1.3 Evaluate hazards through observations of work activities. You have to submit evidence that you can evaluate the hazards by observing the work activities of the employees. You can demonstrate your competence by submitting a hazard identification and evaluation form. 1.4 Examine proposed activities to identify and evaluate hazards, including new workplaces, new equipment, new process, new activities. You have to submit evidence that you can identify and evaluate hazard when there is new workplace, new equipment, new process or new activities being carried out at your workplace. You can submit the records of hazard identification and evaluation form against each. 1.5 Select and use appropriate measuring equipment. You have to submit evidence that you can select and use the appropriate measuring equipment keeping in view the hazards. To demonstrate your competence, you can submit list of equipments, for example, purchase records, calibration records of measuring equipment, training records of measuring equipment, your video of using or installing the measuring equipment. Examples of measuring equipment can be the thermometer, airborne chemicals detection system, pressure gauges, weighing scales, radiation measurements, for example, dosimeters, noise measurement meters, etc. 1.6 Maintain records of hazards identified in sufficient detail to meet the regulatory requirements, organizational requirements, and industry best practices. To demonstrate your competence, you need to submit the evidence that you can maintain the records of the significant OHS hazards in accordance with the requirements of your own organization, as well as the legal requirements and the industry best practices. The evidence can be your organization's procedures for records retention and disposal regarding OHS hazards, records of data analysis and evaluation regarding hazards, screenshot of online health and safety management system which shows the records of the hazards identified. There are 6 assessment criteria in the second learning outcome. 2.1 Select appropriate risk assessment methods. You have to submit evidence that you can select appropriate risk assessment method, for example, quantitative, semi-quantitative, or qualitative risk assessment methods. You can submit your organization's risk assessment procedures or the records of risk assessments for all methods which are being used in your organization. 2.2 Conduct a risk assessment of the hazards which are identified. You have to submit evidence that you can conduct the risk assessment of the hazards which are identified at your workplace. To demonstrate your competence, you can submit the records of risk assessments. 2.3 Select and use instruments or methods to determine the level of exposure affecting employees, others who may be affected. You have to submit evidence that you can select and use the instruments and methods to determine the level of exposure, for example, airborne chemicals, radiations, noise, vibration, or heat, etc. To demonstrate your competence, you can submit records of measurement or monitoring, for example, time weighted average, LTEL, that is long term exposure limit, STEL, that is short term exposure limit, or noise measurement, temperature measurement, etc. Calibration records of measuring monitoring instruments, equipment training records, demonstration of measurement through video, pictures of measuring equipment installed at your workplace with a narrative in your words, the purpose of the specific measuring equipment, purchase records of measuring monitoring equipment, risk assessment control measures which suggest the measuring monitoring equipments against the specific hazards. 2.4 Determine the risk to health and safety of employees, others who may be affected. You have to submit evidence that you can determine the risk to health and safety of employees and other interested parties from various hazards, for example, airborne chemicals, radiation, noise, vibration, or heat, etc. To demonstrate your competence, you can submit the legal limits of exposures, for example, LTEL or STEL, noise, etc., and the measured value from the workplace. You have to submit the records of these. Risk assessment, proposed control strategies records, legal compliance or inspection audit review report, regulatory audit inspection report. 2.5 Prioritize the health and safety risk to employees, others who may be affected. You have to submit evidence that you prioritize the control measures against the risks of exposure to employees and others who may be affected. The evidence can be the control measures, for example, risk assessment results, purchase records of control measures, for example, detection and alarm system, health surveillance or personal protective equipment, etc. 2.6 Maintain records of the risk assessment in sufficient detail to meet statutory requirements, organizational requirements, and industry best practices. You have to submit evidence that you can maintain the records of the risk assessment in accordance with the requirements of your own organization, legal requirement, and the industry best practices. The prospective evidence can be your organization's procedure for record retention and disposal, records of data analysis and evaluation regarding risk assessments, screenshot of online health and safety management system showing the records of risk assessments. Learning outcome 3 has 9 assessment criteria. Let's discuss each. 3.1 Critically analyze the existing risk control measures and current systems of work in the organization. You have to submit evidence that you can analyze if the existing risk control measures and current system of work in the organization are effective and efficient and are serving their intended purpose or not. You can submit the inspection results for risk assessment process, audit reports for the risk assessment process, key performance indicators KPIs for risk assessment process, minutes of the review meeting showing the effectiveness of the risk control measures, corrective actions records, incident investigation records. 3.2 Identify for consideration the risk control measures required by statutory requirements, organizational requirements, industry best practices. You have to submit evidence that you can identify the risk control measures which are required by law, as well as your own organizational needs as per their management system requirements, and is also the best industry practices and is also the industry best practices. The evidence can be list of applicable legal requirements regarding the control measures which are applicable on your organization, list of specific control measures against the hazards in your organizations. 3.3 Identify any additional or improved risk control measures that may be needed. You have to submit evidence that you can identify if there is any need for additional or improved risk control measures keeping in view the specific needs of your organization. The evidence can be risk assessment review and revision records, corrective actions showing additional risk control measures proposals, incident investigation reports, recommendations for additional controls. 3.4 Identify the resources required to implement the risk control measures needed. You have to submit evidence that you can identify what financial, technological, and human resources shall be required to implement the risk control strategies. The evidence can be the resources authorization forms for risk control measures which you send to the top management for authorization, letters or emails sent to purchase department, list of required resources if it is mentioned in your risk assessment form. 3.5 Calculate the cost effectiveness of the risk control measures needed. You have to submit evidence that you can calculate if the proposed control measures are cost effective. For example, you are not proposing costly engineering controls when the risk can be effectively controlled through personal protective equipment or administrative controls. Risk assessment and control records which can be reviewed by the assessor if you proposed cost-effective control measures or not. Evidence of cost-benefit analysis of the control measures, for example, previous year's cost of OHS incidents and reduced cost of OHS incident this year after deployment of risk control measures. The inspection results regarding the efficiency and effectiveness of control measures. 3.6 Consult with the managers, employee representatives, and employees about risk controls needed. You have to submit evidence that you take the suggestions from the managers, employee representatives, and employees when you propose the risk control strategies. You can present the letters or emails showing the consultation process, minutes of the meeting regarding consultation for the risk control strategies, your organizational procedure for risk assessment and control, which shows how you incorporate the inputs and suggestions and feedbacks from various departments and persons when the risk control measures are decided. 3.7 Plan the implementation of risk control measures in order of priority. You have to submit evidence that you plan the implementation of risk control measures in order of priority, that is, how significant the foreseeable risks are. The high risk activities are prioritized. You can submit any communication records regarding the priority of control measures, risk control measures implementation schedule, which shows that high risks are prioritized, risk assessment forms if they mention the priority, for example, normal or urgent. 3.8 Ensure the provision of training for those who need required competencies to implement risk control measures. So you have to submit the evidence that you manage to provide the relevant training if the risk control strategies required competence for implementation. For example, if the risk control strategy is related to admin control or use of personal protective equipment, then you need to provide them with the training how to apply the administrative controls and how to use the personal protective equipment. You can submit training records in which the risk control implementation was focused, communication records, for example, letters or emails, etc., regarding how to implement the risk controls, work instructions for the control measures provided by the manufacturers, etc. 3.9 is maintain records of the control measures in sufficient detail to meet statutory requirements, organizational requirements, industry best practices. So you have to submit evidence that you can maintain the records of the risk control measures in accordance with the requirement of your own organization, legal requirements, and the industry best practices. And for this purpose, you can provide the evidence of procedure for record retention and disposal regarding the risk control measures, records of data and evaluation regarding risk controls, screenshot of online health and safety management system showing the risk control records. The learning outcome 4 is related to the knowledge domain, so you will need to write your response between 250 to 350 words against each assessment criterion. There are total 7 assessment criteria in this learning outcome. 4.1 Evaluate the methods of identification of health and safety hazards within the organization, including risk assessment methods, physical resources, instruments, and survey methods which may be used to determine the level of exposure to people who may be affected. You need to explain how to identify health and safety hazards in your organization. This can be done using different methods such as risk assessment, physical resources, and instrument surveys. Your task is to evaluate these methods and explain how they can be used effectively to identify health and safety hazards within an organization. Be sure to provide examples and explanations that are easy to understand. Your response must be between 250 to 350 words. 4.2 Evaluate principles of analysis methods for determining the risks. Consider the following when responding. Principle of risk analysis methods can be systematic approach, objective and transparent, participatory, appropriate and relevant, iterative, consistent, proportional. Limit your response between 250 to 350 words. Explain external factor influencing the identification of health and safety hazards, including health and safety statutory requirements, acceptability of risks, quality management requirement for documentation. You need to explain how external factors such as health and safety laws, acceptable level of risk, and quality management requirements for documentation can influence the identification of health and safety hazards in your workplace. You should provide example and clear explanation of each factor to demonstrate your understanding of how they impact workplace safety. Your assignment should show these external factors play an important role in ensuring a safe and healthy workplace. Limit your response between 250 to 350 words. 4.4 Evaluate the nature and role of health and safety risk control measures within the organization. You need to evaluate the nature and role of health and safety risk control measures within the organization. Limit your response between 250 to 350 words. 4.5 Justify health and safety risk control measures, including safe system of works. Consider the following when responding. Justify the effectiveness of your organization's risk control strategies against the significant hazards and risks. Limit your response between 250 to 350 words. 4.6 Explain external factors influencing health and safety risk control measures. How external factors can influence your choice for risk control methods. For example, elimination, substitutions, engineering controls, admin controls, or personal protective equipments. Limit your response between 250 to 350 words. 4.7 Evaluate risk control hierarchies. Evaluate the risk control hierarchies against the significant hazards from your workplace in the context of suitability, viability, effectiveness, and cost versus benefit, etc. Your response must be between 250 to 350 words. Learning outcome 5 relates to the continuing professional development. Please download the relevant form from resources section and fill it and submit it
for
to the
your understanding.
as
Just
we did
assume
it for the
that a
previous
health and
units.
safety auditor is visiting your workplace and asking you to provide the evidence of the conformity. The evidence you will present to that auditor will also be valid to demonstrate your competence for NVQ qualifications. So imagine the auditor is asking the following questions from you. What documents, records, or other evidence you will present them to meet the requirements of
So if the auditor asks you, how do you identify the requirements for carrying out health and safety inspections in your organization? That is, what areas in the workplace or what activities or the processes needed to be inspected for health and safety performance? then what will be your response and what documentary evidence will you present to them to support your claim? In the same context, just consider the following questions. How do you inspect your workplace to identify any hazards and evaluate them? How do you evaluate the hazards? By observing the workers doing their tasks. How do you identify and evaluate hazards when there is new workplaces, new equipment, new processes, or new activities? How do you select and use the appropriate measuring equipment keeping in view the hazards? How do you maintain the records of the significant OHS hazards? How do you select appropriate risk assessment methods? How do you conduct the risk assessments? How do you measure and monitor the level of exposure to the employees and others using suitable equipment? How do you determine the risk of health and safety to the employees and others due to the risk of exposure? How do you prioritize the controls against the risk of exposures? How do you maintain the records of the risk assessments as per the legal requirements, your own organizational needs, and the best industry practices? How do you analyze if the existing risk control measures in the organizations are effective and efficient and are serving the intended purpose or not? How do you identify the risk control measures which are required by law as well as your own organization and is also the industry best practices? How do you identify the need for additional or improved control measures if current controls do not meet the expectations? How do you identify the resources needed to implement the proposed risk control measures? How do you calculate the cost effectiveness of the proposed control measures? How do you consult the relevant stakeholders regarding their input and feedback when you need to propose the risk control measures? How do you effectively plan the implementation of risk control measures? How do you provide the necessary training to improve competence in order to effectively implement the risk control measures? How do you maintain the records of risk control measures to meet the legal requirements, your organizational requirement, and the industry best practices? For all assessment criteria from 4.1 to 4.7, you have to demonstrate your understanding by providing the written response in your own words. The response must, however, be between 250 to 350 words against each assessment criterion.